how to choose the best Bible translation. Part 2 of this is going to be, what is the best Bible translation? I could have called this video is more appropriately, how to choose the best Bible translation for you, and there will be another video that reviews about 7 Bible translations and just some opinions on them, and I think most of them are good. You might like one of them, but this is how to choose the best one for you. I'm interested in the Bible because I'm a Christian. I'm interested in translation because I don't know foreign languages. I'm really bad at foreign languages, and I've been really jealous of people who can read the original Greek or go back to these translations and do it for themselves, kind of to see the authentic meanings. And so what I've done instead, knowing I'm bad at foreign languages, is I've read a lot of translations, and I've been trying to, you get opinions when you read all these translations about what the people are doing. Sometimes they tell you at the front what their goals were with the translation, but then you also just find what's better, what works better, where your comprehension is better. And so in this video, it's completely non-professional. I'm not a Bible scholar. I'm not a professor of this. I'm just someone who's interested in translation, who's read a lot of different translations. If you are a Bible scholar and anything I say you think is totally out there weird, make a reply video. The things we're going to cover is literal versus interpretive translation, Protestant versus Catholic translations, making a choice of translation based on how you process information. I think that is the most important thing, actually, that isn't being talked about. How different Bible tools you need to help you with your translation. And the last one's going to be about, introductions and footnotes and things like that. And we'll talk about gimmick Bibles for a moment and things like that. Well, let's first talk about the literal versus interpretive way of translating. This is the number one thing discussed about Bible translations. If you're watching any other videos on YouTube, this is what it's almost the only thing anybody talks about is literal versus interpretive. Go ahead and Google Bible translation spectrum, and you're going to see some pretty cool bars that it's usually the left-hand side of your screen is going to have the most literal translations, the right-hand side is going to have the most interpretive, and then it's going to put a lot of famous translations somewhere on this spectrum. Zondervan used to have a really cool one of these. And this is kind of useful to get a sense of what Bible you have right now and where it fits in the grand scheme of things as far as literal versus interpretive. A literal translation is trying to do a word-for-word translation. This is what the Hebrew or the Greek or whatever the original language is says. This is the translation as directly as possible. An interpretive translation is trying to do a thought-for-thought translation. I have a little bit of issue with this because I regularly read one of the most literal translations, and it's just not that hard to get the concepts out of even an extremely literal translation. I find that sometimes when you get on the more interpretive realm, sometimes the translations have a little bit of a patronizing feeling about them, where they're kind of a little bit talking down to you, making things a little bit too simple for you, and in the process maybe they're losing some secondary meanings of the text. And I also have this problem that, one of the main reasons why we want to read the Bible is to kind of get outside ourselves. Not just get outside ourselves, but get outside our society, get outside our time in history. And, think about how these people were living, in the desert 2,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago. What is happening then? And the more leeway you give a translator to interpret while he translates is also the more the translator's putting himself into the text, and the more he's putting kind of all the different little modern biases we have into the text, and the less you're going to achieve this really getting an outside word, So I would say in general, I've got no problem with interpretive translations. If you really like one, as far as I'm concerned, I'd read Bible quotes from interpretive translations. I would say though that if you're first choosing one, choose something from the middle to the left-hand side of that spectrum. Don't really mess around with the right-hand side if you're going to spend the time to really get to know the Bible. I think you'll get better fruit from that left-hand side. That is kind of the leading issue most people talk about. The thing I don't know if people are afraid to talk about or what, is kind of the Protestant versus Catholic translations. I think a lot of people are secretly worried that if they pick up the Catholic Bible and they read a Catholic Bible, somehow they're getting indoctrinated into Catholicism, or vice versa. Somehow you're getting led away from Catholicism or indoctrinated into Protestantism if you read a Protestant translation. And I found this to be largely a non-issue. I've read multiple Protestant translations. I am a Catholic. I've read multiple Catholic versions. My favorite translation that I would, if there was only one translation I could have, would probably be a Protestant translation. And if there is, like, to the extent you can find these little differences, I think the people they matter to, or when they matter, is when people want to proof text things. So, like, if they're arguing in an argument and they want to say, you know, here's a difference in Protestant Catholic theology, here's a subtle word difference in the translation that happens to support Protestant or Catholic theology a little bit better. One of the famous ones is Isaiah is doing a prophecy about the Virgin Mary. All Christians seem to agree about that. And in one translation it might say young woman, in another translation it might say virgin. So, you know, to me, I don't think a Catholic should be insulted that the Virgin Mary is called a young woman, you know. But it doesn't seem to make that much difference. And I don't do a lot of apologetics, a lot of just arguing about theology and using proof texts and things like this. But when I have and when I do, I actually tend to prefer to use a Protestant translation because it's more widely accepted to the audience you're trying to prove something to. So I tend to think that these Protestant Catholic differences are not big enough to choose a translation on. Having said that, there is one big difference, and that is that there's a section of the Old Testament, the deuterocanonical books, or the apocryphal books, or they have different words for it, but it basically, hopefully we'll have another podcast at some point about how the Bible came to be, but there's a few books in the Old Testament that are in the Catholic Bible that aren't in the Protestant Bible. It has to do with a division that happened a whole long time ago between a Greek Old Testament and a Hebrew Old Testament, and these were in the Greek Old Testament, but weren't always translated into Hebrew. And so, what to do with those books? So, a Catholic Bible will have those books. Some Protestant Bibles have those books too, but generally they don't. They tend to be kind of late Old Testament books. They're almost all at the end of the Old Testament in the Catholic Bible, and that's also when they seem to have been written. For most people, they don't go read the Bible to, like, delve straight into those books. So for most reasons, it's not that important. But you're going to need a Catholic Bible if you want to get a good translation of those books. General acceptance. When you look at these translations, there's a few translations that, by and far, are the most generally accepted translations. The New International Version, typically considered to be a Protestant translation. The New American Bible, the New American Standard Bible is a little bit more obscure but pretty generally accepted. That's a Protestant translation. New American Bible is a Catholic translation. And the Revised Standard, or the New Revised Standard, is kind of a Protestant Catholic cooperative Bible. Like, both sides have had some input into it, and that's a very popular Bible too. When choosing a Bible translation for you to really sink your teeth into, I would suggest always having one of the general translation, one of those four most popular translations: NIV, New International Version, New Revised Standard, New American Bible, or perhaps the New American Standard, as one of your Bible translations. If you have another one that's more obscure that you'd also like to read, and I'm going to suggest you do, great. But have one of those big four, because that's going to be what helps you communicate with all other Christians and know what people are citing and talking about. All right. This brings up a huge issue to me in how I choose my translation. My favorite translation is, how do you process information? Are you a strong reader? Are you not a strong reader? I like to read translations that are hard to read. And if you have a high verbal SAT score or something, then you should be getting a hard translation to read, in my book. And if you're, my dad has a reading disability, and so he reads extremely slowly, he could get an easier translation to read. The reason why I'm saying this is not because some people are smart and some people are dumb or anything like that. But the more you work with it to get the meaning out of it, the more you're going to comprehend and retain. What I mean by this is when I was forced to read Shakespeare in high school and college, you're like reading Shakespeare and all of a sudden you have to like read the passage like 3 times. You're like, what is he really getting at? And then you're like, oh, this is a joke. And then you like uncover the meaning of the joke and you're like, oh, well, that's pretty good. But it's all the more valuable because you spent that little time uncovering it, you know? And my dad, when my dad is like made it super far in life, read many contracts, done big business deals, done all that, not being a very good reader, but man, when he reads, he like sits there and like reads so slow but comprehends it so thoroughly that it's amazing, you know? And you never want to have to sign a lease with him or anything because he will tear it apart line by line. And it's because he's laboring and really thinking through every line as he reads. And when you read the Bible, the problem is that you get this like, one extreme is Shakespeare, where you're like having to retranslate it and you get the fruit of like that effort and really learning what the author's saying. The other extreme is like Hallmark cards, where it's like you're opening it up and it's just a nice little phrase and it's just a nice platitude. And you'll see this like in preaching, that somebody might stand up and say, love your neighbor, love is good, love is God, God is love. And they'll just say these things that have become platitudes, you know, that are they've gone so kind of dry in your, dry is not the right word. They've become so time worn in your mind that you're not even listening to it. It's like loving your neighbor is a pretty radical statement, but it doesn't strike me as radical anymore because I've been told it 10,000 times, you know. So I believe that the more you have to work with translation, the more you're going to get out of it. I'm not necessarily going to endorse that everyone go grab a King James Bible because the King James is the hardest to read. And I think that there are more modern translations that are pretty hard to read. I'll go through like my thoughts on King James and the Catholic version is kind of the Douay-Rheims Bible in another podcast. But the Bible's never hard to read like modern fiction's hard to read, where it's like the author is putting flashbacks and, you know, going out of first and third person narratives and weaving it all together and you're just like having a hard time following what's happening in the novel or something. That's not the way the Bible is hard to read. The Bible is very dry and it's very stark. And it's almost hard to, they're just very solid or confrontational words that you have to like reprocess and put like, what does that mean today? And how would I put that, you know? That's when you're going to get the real meaning out of the Bible. And that's why I suggest getting a Bible that's a little bit harder for you to read so you don't speed read and you don't gloss over things. The next thing I want to talk about is maybe now you've got an idea what translation you want. And those are the 3 main issues with translation: Protestant, Catholic, you know, generally accepted or not generally accepted, literal versus interpretive, and how easy is it for you to read. But once you have the translation down, it's kind of like, what Bible are you going to buy? You know, because, for example, if you decide on the New International Version, it comes bound in everything from the teenage cheerleader version of the Bible to the huge, introductions and footnoted version, the scholarly edition or whatever. There's all these different editions out there. And introductions and footnotes play in a very important role in reading the Bible. And I think they mostly play a negative role. I have a couple Bibles that I really like for their footnotes, but for the most part I dislike footnotes and introductions. Why? I think as a general rule, in any type of writing, footnotes should all be interesting and relevant, or they should all be irrelevant, because then you know what to do with them. The worst case is when 1 out of 10 is really good, because then you have to read all 9 that kind of are irrelevant to get the one that's relevant. So you want a translation that has very few footnotes that are well worth reading, or you want a translation where you just don't care about the footnotes, you never read any of them, and it's fine, you know. That's a minor point. The bigger point is a lot of why is the Bible read at all? We're reading it to discover the meaning of life, to get closer to God, to find out why this book for thousands and thousands of years has been passed down as a holy scripture. That's why people wake up in the morning and spend an hour reading their Bible. That's why people memorize verses. That's why it's so relevant, you know. But there's also a lot of reasons to study the Bible that just aren't that, you know. Like, there are people who are debating who really authored the letter of the Hebrews, you know, or you know, there's a bunch of modern people who are bothered by the supernatural events in the Bible. Like, were they really supernatural events, or did somehow all these factors just converge to make a big coincidence at this time? Or was the Bible author, you know, meaning something else by this, not supernatural, like not a miracle in the way we think of an overt miracle, but something else, you know, like one of the famous ones that I think gets beaten to the ground is whether or not the feeding of the, you know, 500 or 5,000 was a bunch of people sharing their food, or whether or not actual food materialized, you know. And the problem with all of this is kind of a modern problem, and it's a little bit of a scholarly problem. It's not spiritually edifying. And what I find is they have these Bibles, the New American Josephite or Joseph something or other edition is really bad at this. They have these long introductions that introduce you to some scholarly debate about the authorship debate of the Bible, of the book you're getting ready to read, or where it came from, or what we know about it, or whatever. And it's filling you with this useless information. It's right at the front, so if you're new to it, you're reading it, and it colors your read, you know. You're no longer going after the meaning of life. You're kind of secretly wondering, well, did Paul write this or not, you know? And it's kind of ruining the read. And I've actually thrown away Bibles with bad, you know, introductions at the beginnings of the books of the Bible, because they're taking away from the real reason to read it. You know, I'm not saying that some scholar somewhere shouldn't be writing an article on it, but why we're handing these Bibles out with these introductions makes no sense. So I prefer Bibles that have no introductions and very little footnotes, as a rule, with a couple exceptions. So, couple Bible tools that you're going to want, even if you're going to spend any quality time with your Bible. There's something called a concordance, and there's something called a comparative translation. A concordance is now almost obsolete because the internet does it for you. What it is think of a word, pomegranate, and you type it in, and it shows you every single verse in the Bible where a pomegranate is. I've got an old one where they, like, you know, somebody went through by hand and, like, you know, compiled, you know, a cross-reference of every word in the Bible, and it's huge compared to the Bible. And they're pretty cool. And it's pretty cool because you can kind of, like, take ideas and go through the different biblical books, which were written at different times with different authors, and see how that idea was handled in the prophets, in the historical books, in the New Testament, in the Gospels, you know. And that's like a pretty interesting, like the idea of Savior, or the term Son of Man is used a couple different ways that are really amazing, you know, or interesting. And the concordance is going to help you do that. Also, when you just can't remember the verse and you're like, there was a verse that said something like this and you can't remember it, use your concordance, look it up. The other thing is the comparative translation. Concordances are free on the internet, so you don't really need to buy one. They're kind of nice to have bound up if you're just into books. The other thing is the comparative translation. What it does is, there's a couple different versions of it, but you open it up. The one I'm familiar with is made by Zondervan, and it puts 4 translations, the Zondervan one, side by side by side by side. So you'd be like Luke chapter 4 verses 1 through 30, the first part of chapter 4. And it'll be like boom, and then it'll have the next translation, boom, boom, boom. And usually one of them is very literal, and usually one of them is very interpretive. And you can kind of see the way different translators have worked through those verses. That's pretty interesting. I've never been able to use that as a daily devotional tool, but I use it to kind of like subtle differences or to like just kind of go deeper at times. It's kind of a bad daily Bible. It's huge for one, but 2, it's just kind of really distracting to have 4 different versions of the same text there sitting in front of you. But it's a really cool thing to have. I would suggest anyone who's seriously about going into that. I'd also suggest not getting any of the gimmick Bibles. Like, even if you're buying a gift for somebody, don't get like the athlete's Bible or the whatever. Get the Bible. Part of what's cool about the Bible is people so different from all of us wrote it. People so different from all of us across the world read it. And we're all being drawn together by this commonality. And I feel like it's a little bit patronizing when you kind of like pitch it to somebody. I mean, it's like the ultimate scholarly text where we all have access, you know? And so I would just give them the Bible and let it be that. And the other thing that I think can be nonsense to stay away from is at the beginning of a lot of Bibles, it will tell you the translation process. This is pretty cool, particularly like I think in the New Revised Standard Version, there's a pretty good talk about the translation process. New American Standard, NIV, they all have these good little talks about the translation process. And they talk about, the number of scholars that worked on it, how they reviewed it, how they just settled their disputes or whatever. Some people try to claim that certain versions of the Bible have a divinity or have some type of divine intervention that helped them translate it. The biggest one is the King James Version. If you're on YouTube if you're seeing this video, so search, King James Divine or something like that, and you're going to see a bunch of really, I hate to say it, weird videos about that, and it just doesn't make sense at the end of the day, and it's a waste of time. In the Catholic circle, sometimes you'll hear like the Dewey Rheims is a more anointed version or something like that. It's kind of a weird opinion to have. It's not widespread. I think in the end of the day, the Bible is full of so much dynamite. It's full of so much spiritual and supernatural information that even a clumsy translation is totally amazing. And to like get hung up on these little picky picks is not serving God and not serving you learning about the Bible. So forget all that and choose a Bible based on literal versus interpretive, based on the footnotes and the introductions, based on how you process information and how you're going to get the most out of it, which I suggest difficulty to read. And the last thing is, if you need the Catholic books of the Old Testament, which I believe every Catholic will eventually need if they're trying to read the whole Bible, get a Catholic translation that has those deuterocanonical books. Thank you for listening to the Simple House video podcast.